Okay, hello everyone. I see that more and more people are funneling in, so we'll just give it a second as everyone enters from the waiting room. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, we'll just give it a second here. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to get set up. Okay, great. Thank you for joining us for this evening's lecture with Walter Hood. I'm Assistant Professor Susie Harris-Brantz, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everyone to the second lecture in this year's Forum Lecture Series, which we've themed Reassemble. The notion of assembly is at the core of architecture, from building materials to community connections, theoretical frameworks, programmatic uses, structural components, and project teams. As we navigate new ways of convening and interacting with one another, this series asks, how might both ourselves and our surrounding built environment reassemble? As you can see, we have an outstanding lineup for this year, so please mark your calendars for these upcoming events. For more information about the Forum Lecture Series, as well as how to register or to watch previous recordings, please visit our website. We'd like to thank this series' founding sponsors for their ongoing support. We further extend that thanks to all those at our school who are assisting behind the scenes. Today's lecture with Walter Hood is generously supported by the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects, and we're lucky to be joined by Ryan James, Chair at Landscape Architecture Ottawa, who I'll now invite to say a few words. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susie. As you said, Ryan James here, and I'm here to represent the OLA, more specifically, the Hardy Bunch of OLA members over in the Ottawa region. And I first heard Walter Hood speak more than 20 years ago, I'm pretty sure of that. I was impressed at the time, and I'm willing to bet that Walter Hood is even better today. I'm very happy to have him here. This Forum Lecture Series is a first-rate affair for thinking in architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and the fascinating cases where the boundaries between the disciplines get blurry. The OLA is very proud to be a co-sponsor for this event, and our thanks go out to all those who have helped pull this evening together. We're very eager to get on with it. Thank you very much, Susie.
Thanks, Brian. And now we get to this evening's talk. A brief reminder to please not use the chat function, but if you could instead use the Q&A function. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jake Chakasim, who's recently joined our school as an assistant professor cross-appointed with Carleton School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies. Jake and myself will join Walter for a discussion alongside the Q&A following the lecture. I'll now pass to Jake to say a few opening words for tonight and to introduce our esteemed speaker. Oh, you're muted, Jake.
There we go, up to a good start. Thank you very much. For that reason, I want to take a few minutes for a second to share an image of the screen and try something different this time around. Normally, we open up many of these presentations with an acknowledgement of traditional territories, but in this case here, I want to try something a little different by holding just a small moment of silence just to think about it. All right, so I'm going to dive into introducing our guest speakers tonight. Walter Hood. Walter Hood is a creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California. Hood Design Studio is a cultural practice working across art, fabrication, design, landscape, research, and urbanism. He is also the David K. Wu Chair and the Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. He lectures on and exhibits professional and theoretical projects nationally and internationally. He was recently the spring 2020 Diane Balmori Visiting Professor at the Yale School of Architecture and spring 2021 Senior Loeb Scholar for the Harvard GSD Loeb Fellowship. Walter creates urban spaces that resonate with and enrich the lives of current residents while also honoring communal histories. Hood melds architectural and fine arts expertise with a commitment to design ecologically sustainable public spaces that empower marginalized communities. Over his career, he has transformed traffic islands, vacant lots, and freeways and underpasses into spaces that challenge the legacy of neglect of urban neighborhoods. Through engagement with community members, he teases out the natural and social histories as well as current residences, shared patterns and practices of use and aspirations for place. In terms of awards, there are numerous to mention. The studio's award-winning work has been featured in publications including Dwell, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fast Company, Architectural Digest, Place Journal, and Landscape Architecture 2 magazine. Walter Hood is also a recipient of the 2017 Academy of Arts and Letters of Architecture Award, the 2019 Knight Foundation Public Spaces Fellowship, 2019 MacArthur Fellowship, 2019 Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize, and most recently the 2021 United States Art Fellowship. Hood is also a fellow of the American Academy of Rome and one of the 2021 elected members of the Academy of Arts and Letters. Hood Design Studio has also been featured in the 2021 AD 100 list. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Walter.
Oh, we got you muted, Walter.
Like I would know this by now, right?
Sure, you know, gets us all.
Well, it's a pleasure, Suzanne, Jake, and Ryan to be here, and all of the fellow Ottawanians, I guess, is that a term? Or people, the Canadians. It's my pleasure to speak with you tonight. I think your idea of reassembling has connotations towards landscape just as it does through architecture. And I think we kind of see that through this moment of silence where we both, you and myself, we live in and on colonial land. And this land has been assembled in a completely different way. And I think the work now is how do we best reassemble it and bring all the voices together. I'd like to share with you some of the work from our studio tonight. Can you see my screen? All good? And I'd like to start with a very simple project to get things going. We were invited to this year's Chicago Biennale. We've now done the Biennale twice. And the first year we did it, we made fake trees. We fabricated fake trees to talk about how 3 presidents sit in the Chicago landscape. This year, as I was doing research, I noticed that as the Illinois landscape was laid out, they actually used white oak trees to create benchmarks. And so this year we created a piece called Witness that takes 16 trees that have southern roots that deal with a southern migration, and we bring it to a gridded plain in Chicago. And they will be there for a year, and residents will tie tags on them, and they will talk about what they've witnessed in the last 18 months. And hopefully over time, these trees will then be taken to other parts of the city, and they then will become a witness to the last 2 years of our pandemic and civil unrest. It's currently located in the south side of Chicago, where there's numerous sort of vacancies and land that has not been valued. And so through the growth of these trees and through these neighborhood contexts, we wanted to sort of get people to kind of understand this larger landscape and how we can reassemble it back, possibly just through the verdancy of the city that has not made its way to the south side of Chicago. A lot of our projects, our firm has been together about 25 years, and a lot of our projects attempt to go back in time and understand place. And this diagram here for Lafayette Square Park, you can see we were looking at an 1840 square, and then by 1900, it became a park. And this idea, again, that the landscape has been changed over time, we try to work backwards and try to reassemble the landscape to evoke some of those colonial past, but also a contemporary future. So 25 years ago, we were able to basically build a space that talks about its past, but also its current context. And during this redesign, Homelessness was paramount in this neighborhood. And so what you're seeing here at the top is a restroom facility that we were able to fundraise for, as well as a community shelter and barbecue and other things to allow people to sort of be in a landscape that's layered. And over time, through electricity and other things, people actually find a way to live. And even in this current moment today, the park has become a place for people to go to. And during COVID, it was one of those places that was open to all. Our projects look at history, but we try to sort of weave through these kinds of cultural memories. This is Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. It's probably a late 19th century image. It was one of the largest sand dunes in San Francisco. We worked with Herzog and de Meuron 15 years ago to create what's called the New de Young Museum. That's located in the sand dune. Working with the architects, we wanted to sort of create a landscape and a building that each echoed each other. And we wanted to tell the story of this fiction, which is this park in a sand dune. If you look at the park, you would actually think it was a forest and that it's natural. But all of the plants that you see here are brought in from the context. Some were even gifted from Australia. And so as we begin to kind of talk about this fiction, we went like a half mile around the museum site, and we brought all the plants that you see in the park, and we brought them to the museum to again tell a different story of time and history, where art and culture gets woven against a machined piece of architecture that looks like it just landed in the park. But through this idea of kind of weaving these stories, whether it's through the paving, whether it's through the sky space from Terrell and other art pieces, the landscape pretty much reassembles itself from its prior use, but it also suggests these new and different uses that might happen. We like to think of, landscape having objects just like sculpture. These palm trees were gifted to the museum in 1890s. By the time we started designing this in 1999, they were all beat up. We talked the director into taking them out of the ground, taking them to a nursery, giving them great haircuts. They sat for 2-3 years, and then we bought them back. They sit on top of a parking garage. So this fiction that you're looking at, it seems like there's ground, but when you go into the tunnel and you come into the museum, you look back and you actually see the palm trees floating in air. And as you move around the museum, there are these moments where art, light, reflection, landscape all come together to tell a different story. And as you come down into the basement of the museum, the landscape comes down through the tree ferns that were gifted from Australia. And then going back out, there are 2 different gardens. One's a sculpture garden and one's a children's garden. And these are donor-based. But I have to sort of say, within the whole context, this is still a public park. The Park and Recs Department take care of the land around the building. So in a way, it's a kind of strange set of relationships, right, between an institution and a public place. But over the last 10 years, what has happened is the gardens have become part of the neighborhood and the museum has become part of the city. I can't talk about where this project is, but I wanted to talk about how we're assembling a landscape for work. We were asked by a client to create for about 1.7 million square feet, I think probably about 5,000 people, could we create a landscape in which people could work? The buildings are the scale of airports, pretty much. This is here in the Bay Area. But very early, we were thinking about this idea of a large trellis where people could go out into the landscape and be under a huge roof. And then people would take their work out and actually use the landscape, not for leisure, but as a place. And then COVID hit. And while we're under construction, we became just these brilliant people because we had this forecast for this outdoor space that everyone loves now, everyone can use. We're just probably 80% in construction. But here's the plan. You can kind of see the landscape is this in-between space. There's a series of catwalks and floating walks and a roof that holds photovoltaics, provides shade and shadow. And we have what we call tree houses for people to come out and use in different ways. This is a view an idealized view. And then this is a real view. The building reflects the landscape and the landscape reflects the building. As you move through, the verdancy of the landscape actually creates a series of rooms in which you can inhabit. And as you look up into the sky, again, you have this idea of the trellis providing shading. We use renewable materials everywhere between wood, wood paving, wood seating. And we really try to think about the flora in this area. This is in an area that's getting warmer. So we're able actually through climate to create lots of nooks and crannies for people to actually go out and be in. You can kind of see they're still doing touch-ups to the landscape. But at the scale, what we tried to do was make these strange settings. And one of the prompts that we had was, I want people working on rocks. And so we have rocks and hills and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see if the engineers will actually come out and work in such a verdant place. But thinking about the scale of these two buildings, we have this, how can I say, intermediate landscape that's created by these tree houses. And so as you rise above, the scale of the entire landscape changes. And so now you're tied to the more regional landscape, which is the valley. And the verdancy is growing up from the ground through. So hopefully in 18 months or so, these will be completely shrouded in green. And what you're seeing are the East Bay Hills here from a distance as you're up on that second level. And once inside the tree houses, they become these cozy little moments set in this verdant forest. And they have views back out to the landscape. So immediately you lose the buildings that are hugging it on both sides. And then as you make your way across the skywalks, it's almost like you're in a science fiction where the PV panels, the verdancy from below, it's almost as if these tree houses have landed here. And looking back across, the landscape is reflected again. And as you make your way to the larger tree house, this is for the larger group settings. The wood just ensconces you and creates, again, a variety of settings from tables to chairs to lounges for people to use. And these landscapes will probably be filled with tables and chairs and other accoutrements that people will need for work. Sticking with the same energy-related idea, we want a competition at the University of Buffalo to take 5,000 3x5 PV panels that were gifted to the university and to try to make a different statement to the university experience. In the right-hand corner here, you see a green diagram where we were able to sort of see that the university at Amherst, they basically moved a creek to create the university. So they rerouted the creek around it. And when they did that, they pretty much removed all the topsoil in the university. And so the trees 30 years later never really took off. And so we had this very simple idea going back and again, trying to reassemble this complex landscape that was once agrarian, that then became suburban, but the creek was somehow missing. And so bringing this wetland back through, we were able to recharge this landscape and actually create a wildlife habitat. The basic idea for laying out the PV panels, where we located dormitories that would be fed by the energy, and then we created a script that we were able to run that's based on photometrics, where you can only have a certain amount of PV panels in a group. I think there are 15, and you can't shade one another. And so we were able to create this linear strand that actually the panels, when they change sizes, the spacing of them changes. So they really create a kind of their own DNA pattern. And then we just let the landscape go. And by letting the landscape go, it then went through its successional phase. We stopped mowing it, and we only mow these bands, these lines. So everything else is whatever is going to come up. And 3 years after this was done, we were certified as a wildlife sanctuary because new species came up and other animals actually came into this landscape. And I was told, I don't know if it's fiction or not, when the certification was going on, they came out and they were walking through the site, and a hawk came down and grabbed a groundhog out of the ground and ripped his head off. And that was like a good blessing. I don't know how true that is, but this gives you a kind of a feeling for technology, right? And this kind of wildness together. And what I really like about the project, when you're here by yourself, you just hear noises, right? I mean, you hear things rustling in the ground, you look up overhead, and you have this wonderful interface, right, between culture, technology, and ecology. And as we were building the project, and of course, this project is about 5 acres in size, they were tearing down buildings on campus, and we were able to take the recycled concrete and create this amazing plaza here. So every Earth Day, students can come under these large PV panels and have all kinds of demonstrations to talk about sustainability. This next project is in Los Angeles. There's 2 projects, 3 I'm going to show you in Los Angeles. 2 of them are sculptures and 1 of them is a site. And I think they are all tied together through their same logic of trying to tease out the colonial history here on one site, an industrial history at another site, and a cultural history at another site. I've always been interested in the saints in Los Angeles. There's Santa Monica, and I did research, and Santa Monica, she came to the aid of the Spanish soldiers who were inebriated, so she wept for them, and when she wept, a garden emerged. And so we have this idea in Santa Monica where there is no sense of the inert material that actually created the place, that we wanted to sort of put sandstone out in a public realm and actually create this crying rock. And so at the metro station, 1.5 by 2 meter pieces of stone is stacked against a west-facing wall. And the west-facing wall is planted gold and planted with white roses. Along the stone, there are these glass bulbous shapes. So every day at sunset, the refraction from the light against the stone creates the tears. And as we were making the project, I had the opportunity to meet a Tonga elder, who was one of the local natives. And she said, Walter, I really want to do this ritual for your project, because we call it the Crying Rock, not Santa Monica Tears. And so we took that name and layered that name. And so the project has these 2 names that hopefully create this tension. But it's on a public sidewalk. It's kind of rock that you've never really seen before. It's got all these marks, but it creates this curiosity, but it also creates this ritual every day. And here's a better idea of the bulbous. So these are all cast glass pieces. And its cousin, about 15 miles away in Wilmington, is a series of stack blocks, which we did maybe 6 years ago. So that was our first foray into this thinking. And we were able to, again, go to Ojai and mine the sandstone and bring it to a place where no natural materials exist. And again, as we stack the stone here, we wet the top, so they sprinkle. But as soon as they went up, the kids came out of nowhere. And it's very interesting. Again, in the park, there's only AstroTurf and red lights everywhere. So this idea, again, of thinking about that geological history and bringing it up to the forefront allowed us to then see the larger landscape, where before our columns, you never really notice the vertical stacks of the refinery in the distance. So again, by mining the core, you actually allowed us the context to actually be drawn in. And in downtown Los Angeles, where Guy Brode built his masterpiece, the Brode Museum, designed by Diller Scofidio Renfro, the Vault in the Veil, there was no landscape, and we were asked to create a landscape adjacent. And we looked to the freeway to do this, because since there was no land, only a tunnel, we looked at the freeway infrastructure. And if you look at the beams under a freeway, we just turn them upside down. And then we were able to put dirt in it and actually grow trees. The trees are 110-year-old olive trees that we found in the valley. And then we bought stumps. And so there's a cultural fiction gets set up on this freeway where there are these things that are old and these things that look like they've died, but they've all been bought here. And they actually provide this new way of seeing the landscape in Los Angeles. And people, it's as if people had never seen a tree before. These trees are all gnarly. They have personality. People take their pictures with the tree. People touch the trees. It's as if, these trees are telling a story of life. And they create these moments, right, against the kind of the frenzy of LA for people to take time out. And they contrast to the museum versus trying to blend in. And against this huge machine, precast concrete, scaleless facade, then the landscape is able to sort of find its place. It's not doing a lot. It just creates a small little green postage stamp with a grove of trees. And at night, the spectacle then becomes that lifted piece of lawn. There's a restaurant in the back. There's housing on one side, the museum on the other. And as we were planting our trees, the people in the housing, they were like, I love those trees. Where can we get them? So they bought a half dozen more. So we're actually creating a beautiful old aged olive grove next to the Broad Museum. And then in front of the museum, that's still over a tunnel. We wanted to remind people again that there's no dirt there. And so these bulbous planters gingerly remind you that there's something afoot. And just thinking about these two scales, right? I mean, again, how one deals with architecture. Sometimes you have to let architecture be. We talked a lot about putting trees in front of this thing, but at the end of the day, it wants to be here. The landscape wants to be here. At the University of Virginia, about a decade ago, they were looking to expand Thomas Jefferson's lawn southward because the university has run out of room. On the right-hand side, you can see the Ecumenical Village here to the left and the projected area down south of the McKean Mead and White building. As they were excavating for the south lawn, they actually found bodies. There was like 28 different bodies of people, humans and animals. And it turned out that the remains had to do with Catherine Foster, who was a free Black woman who worked when the school was for boys, mending and doing, odd jobs associated with the university. Her landscape had been totally forgotten. We were able to then do the archaeology and exhume it. And then there's a place for Kitty Foster within this development. When we dug, we actually found this beautiful stone and use of materials to create a garden and landscape. And so pedagogically, the landscape tells this story of this paved courtyard, the Foster home, the well, and all of these other ancillary issues that related to her laundry business and her help with the boys. But we also wanted to do something else that had a stronger ritualistic attitude to it. So we created what we call a shadow catcher. And along where the former house is, again, we created a gridded plan to evoke the archaeological sort of understanding of the site. But we're also interested in this mythology of flash of the spirit, that in many Southern landscapes, particularly in burial grounds, you'll always find something shiny. And when the light hits something shiny, it refracts the light. And it is believed in a lot of cultures that that light gives you a ride to heaven, that you need a portal, right, to leave this earth. And so when there's sun out, you actually get a shadow, and then you look up, you actually then will get a reflection of the stainless steel roof. And so there's this moment where light and shadow are happening. It's almost like thunder and lightning, right? You have these two phenomenological things happening. And then when the sun goes away, everything is muted. But this ritual, again, of the ground to the sky, was pretty much the experiential aspect that we wanted the site to evoke. And we also wanted it to be completely different than all the brick that you find at UVA. And the university's policy of not having contemporary buildings within the old campus allows this to kind of read as a special thing, as a special place. And then in the place to reinterm the bodies, we then did research of historic cemeteries around Charlottesville. And one of the things we found, whether they were wooded, whether they were in homesteads, were that, you know, when bodies are interned in wood, the ground settles. And so what you would read are these beautiful sculpted ground planes when you went to an old cemetery. And so we created this sculptural plane to talk about that without having to numerate how many bodies and who they were. And this is seen from the art history building. Another project in the South, this one's in Nashville, Tennessee. Again, another small public art works. Here, with a meager budget, we were asked to conceptualize the civil rights movement that happened here in Nashville. And I knew very little of Nashville civil rights history. I'm from North Carolina. And again, I thought Greensboro was the first lunch counter sit-in, but evidently Nashville has a longer history, and they were one of the first cities to actually integrate their lunch counters, because they were one of the first cities to actually see the economic devastation that was happening by not integrating. The site is located next to City Hall. This was a fallow space on one side. If you go down the hill, there's the hockey arena for you Canadians. So it's really near kind of the hub in downtown, and the river is off to the right. It's a very small space, a series of walls reactivate just a small passive space. We left the lights, we left the benches there, but we just added these new walls within that. And then as we were developing the project, we were privy to photographs that were taken by the local newspaper in the mid 60s and late 60s. These pictures were never published in the paper because you have to remember, during a lot of the early civil rights in America, you know, taking photos of agitators were ways in which the police were able to squelch a lot of the activities. And so here you see this Black woman and her daughter and a gentleman walking past a gauntlet of people, probably saying things that we probably can't repeat. Or this one where this beautiful Black woman and her two beautiful daughters are walking through this gauntlet of hate, even from the kids. You can actually see the small kids actually spewing, you know, things that, you know, they probably heard from their elders. And then this one, which is, you know, showing two guys incarcerated and people looking on. And again, the more I looked at these photos, one, the more they reminded me that this could be today, but it also made me think about the people in the photographs. Like this guy is looking directly at the camera. So he's aware that he's being photographed. And so how can we use these images? And so what we were able to do was to create walls that read almost like block prints. These are 8.5 feet tall. On one side, we reconceptualized some of the images with women and created these new collages that are based on these religious or Renaissance paintings by Piero della Francesca that give them the strong, imposing side of the wall. And as you get up close, the resolution breaks down, and it then is really about the material. And as you move around, a narrative weaves itself through the walls. And then on the other side of the wall, we take photoreal images and CNC them, inscribe them in the wall. So when there's no light, there's no image. And when the light hits this side of the wall, the faces actually come out of the wall. And in a way, this project builds on what Toni Morrison, the Pulitzer Prize writer, talked about after she wrote her Pulitzer Prize winner novel, Beloved. And she made a statement, which I'll come back to, that in the US, there's no place for my ancestors and people like me to go and sit and actually think about our ancestors. And Toni Morrison actually created a nonprofit that created benches throughout. And so some of this work that you're seeing is some of that memory work, where now there's a place in Nashville where you can go and sit and you can be with your ancestors and at this moment. It's not a memorial, it's just a space that brings out, right, those cultural patterns and practice, and primarily that memory over time. And for a lot of the civil rights veterans who are here in this image, this notion of not forgetting, they fought for years to get something out in the public realm. And at the opening, this is Freddie on the right, who has this long civil rights history, and that's his cousin here on the left. And on opening day, Freddie came up to me and he pointed to himself. So Freddie is the guy, the young guy in the photo very early. And it was interesting that he never came forward to tell me that. And he knew the picture was being done, but in a way I find that emblematic of its day, right? Which is really different from today, where everyone wants to be known. You know, these were silent people walking and marching. You know, they were behind the scenes pushing forward. And I think we need to kind of return to that same kind of attitude today versus the me day, me, and maybe it's we. These next two projects are, one is under construction and one just completed. But building on this idea of the Ancestors Garden by Morrison, we were contacted maybe 5 years ago by Harry Cobb from Pay Cobb Freed, architects out of New York, wonderful architects. Harry passed away right when COVID hit in early 2020. I think IM just passed away this past summer. So that part of their firm has left this amazing legacy. But when Harry called me, he said, this is a very important project, Walter, and we really want you to get involved along with Guy Nordenson because this is all about landscape and structure. I had been working through art projects in Charleston and the Low Country over the last decade, primarily through the Art Institute and the Art Fair here, documenting some of the old Gullah Geechee settlements throughout the community and doing installations like this one, which is called Rice Table, where we grew rice for 3 months in this downtown courtyard to call attention to the Carolina gold rice, where the enslaved helped propagate and allowed the colonists to actually make billions of dollars, but also this wetland where the city sits is not recognized. And so in a way, this project early really brought us into Charleston and gave us a particular view of the place. The IAM will be an international center. It is not like the National Museum to African American in Washington, D.C., where everything, baseballs, music, everything is in that museum. But this one's really about American history and particularly the role of African Americans in creating the country and the world we know today, and particularly to Charleston and the Low Country. If you've never been to Charleston, it's located in this long peninsula, what's called the Neck. There are two rivers that go up each side of the neck, and those rivers were really important to the rice cultivation. The building is located at Gadsden's Wharf. Gadsden's Wharf is one of the older and largest wharfs during the last few years of slavery in the United States. It's believed that at the site, upwards of 40% of the enslaved Africans that came to North America actually passed through this port. So this would be really the first site that's hollowed ground that really is a real place. We were able to do the archaeology, and sure enough, the warehouse and some other elements were located there. I'd like to also call attention to Mother Emmanuel AME Church, which is 4 blocks away to the left here. And this was the site of the massacre 4 or 5 years ago, where the young white kid came down and killed the parishioners in the church. So we have these very powerful sites that we need to reimagine here in this place. Here's the historic map. You can kind of see the warehouse, this long series of, shallow rooms, and you can kind of see how large it was. It was just pretty broad and pretty long. We went out to the site. The end of land's end is way back here, but currently the bulkhead sits out here. We're 7.5 feet off the ground because of tide and also because of hurricane. This is the promenade. Tourists come here to go to the aquarium and to go out to the Civil War sites that are located out in the harbor. It was a park before we started, so the memory of the site for a lot of people is like this guy and his dog out here. So it's going from this kind of greensward plan to a site of heavy remembrance. The building by Paycobb Freed is about as long as a soccer pitch. So it's a little over 100 yards long. It sits up about 13 feet site slope. So it goes from 13 to 17 feet up. When it faces towards the Atlantic, it has views that are tied, and then it faces back to the city. We were asked to conceptualize the site and to really think about those memories within the site. And so reviewing the plan, everything to the north of the building is about the Low Country. It's about how that landscape was actually created through enslaved hands. We're next to a pump house that's constantly pumping water out and during high tide and a hurricane. So everything to the north, you can't build on it. So we're able to then grow grasses and talk about the kind of the cultural landscape that comes out of this marine feature. Pathways bring you under the building. The building has this beautiful soffit that just kind of floats in a light color that allows the light to go from one end to the other. And we have a series of gardens, from a stele garden where we have stone that has sound, to an ethnobotanical garden, to a series of rooms where people can actually find solace. To the south, half of the warehouse is shown here because we don't own the rest of the site, but we were able to locate that architecturally and archaeologically. And visitors are asked to walk through this gauntlet that's part of the warehouse. The landscape is a series of small garden spaces, whether they're groves of palm trees, places where rice is cultivated, small little parterred rooms where people can go for solace, sort of a rock garden room, and the ethnobotanic room. And in plan, we wanted them to almost read like a colonial garden, because if you go out to the plantations within the area, it has, I guess the French garden was a classical, inspiration for a lot of the early colonial gardens here in Charleston. And then along the edge, we flood the entire edge with water on the right-hand side. That then becomes our Atlantic crossing fountain. At night, the site will be open, like most of all the historic sites through Charleston. You can imagine a lot of debate, particularly after the Mother Emmanuel event, that this site should be closed, it's going to get vandalized. But we also thought that, again, through the reimagination of this landscape, that we wanted it to be open, that we want that nighttime experience to just be as powerful as that daytime experience. So as you come from the city, we've exaggerated these sort of dune-like landscapes to talk about that primary dune, and you're actually going back out to the wetlands. And then when you look back to the city, it's actually enveloping you. We want to take away most of the context. The ground plane and the columns are made from shale called tabby, and we wanted the underneath to almost feel like the ocean floor. And Harry wanted the tabby to come up and be the columns. The columns are 2 meters wide, so you can actually hug these columns. They're really, really big. And so this whole underneath, as if the building is perched up and the Atlantic is allowed underneath. So coming in from the sweetgrass field, you see the reflect band that marks where that edge was. These vertical totems that again will have sound and music emanating from them. the ethnobotanic garden that will be constantly changed to talk about the kinds of botanical seeds that the enslaved brought with them. There are stories of women hiding seeds in their hair, different kind of braids allowed you to sort of bring different botanics across. The rice planters, areas that we can flood with water, again, echoing that installation I was showing you earlier, but places where people can learn about rice cultivation, and particularly what was called the rice Negro, which was a sought after worker from West Africa who could stay in water all day without contracting malaria. And then looking back towards the warehouse, the walls sort of evoke, that this was a separate site. We have a quote from Maya Angelou that will float across this piece. And then when you walk down the gauntlet, we have about 5 sculptures that actually begin to kind of portray the enslaved inside, right, this enclosed place against reflective granite. And at night, again, hopefully it'll be very spooky. It'll have a very strong kind of sense of enclosure, but also of enslavement. And these are some of the early figures that we're casting out of concrete. And these will be stark white concrete images, and hopefully over time, moss and things like that will grow on them. And then the last sort of the inspiration for the fountain had to do with the Brooks map. And the Brooks map was a lithograph of a ship that came, a Dutch ship. And it was one of the first images that got abolitionists thinking about the cruelty of slavery, because it's actually showing how slaves are actually stored in the hull of the ships. Gender and through kids. Kids are placed in the middle, male, female are separated, and they're stacked on top of one another, head to toe, head to toe. And one day, as we were making our way out to Sullivan's Island, this is the view back out towards the Atlantic, I came across in a small little museum a Xerox. It looked like a Xerox of a Brooks map, or a map that showed it. But I also, it was on my phone for a long time, and it looked like textile. And once I started thinking about this, we then had an idea that could we take these corpses and actually put them on the ground and actually create a fountain that could get flooded, right? And these were abstract enough where I thought gender and kids, I didn't have to talk about that because they're these abstract figures. So at the edge, as creating this infinity fountain, which is about a quarter inch of water, we tilt the slope back from the edge back to a stainless steel edge that will again mark the edge of the wharf, but it's also where that flash might happen. And then we started thinking about the crushed shell with the concrete. And so by making the corpses and then pressing the shell in the corpses, we then had a way to kind of talk about the graphic quality of the ground. And when it gets wet, the notion that the shells, again, the ground's alive, and it's trying to tell a story as if we scooped up all the shells from the Atlantic crossing, and they're actually here. And then this kind of serialization of the figures over time. And so at the edge where you have the fountain, again, this is sitting up on the bulkhead, so it's a fiction. You have a stainless steel band that will have all of the different locations where people were taken from and enslaved, and that's the line that you cross over. And then looking back out towards the harbor, when the fountain is flooded, it's just a piece of water reflecting the sky and the sun, because as you're looking there in the morning to the afternoon, this light will be constantly refracting across the soffit. And then the water will drain out, and those figures will become apparent again, and the water will fill up and drain out. This is the install that's happening now. You can kind of see the tabby in the actual corpses and the detail that becomes so abstract when you zoom in to zoom out, and it creates this otherly pattern on the ground. So that column is 2 meters wide, so you get a sense of the scale. And then looking across the long way, it's almost a topography of bodies. that actually roll up against this brick wall. And you'll have views back out to the harbor. So you can imagine when this floods, you'll actually see the water into the harbor, and hopefully it'll become one thing. And this is a view, it's a strange view. It's a view from the fire stair looking down. So you actually see the scale of the figures. And so as you're coming out of the balcony from the museum, you'll have these moments where you'll look down and you'll see the bodies. They'll go all the way to the wall to the side. And the last project I'd like to share with you is Double Sights. It's a project that was met with a lot of pain and discussion prior to the pandemic. The African-American students at Princeton, I think maybe the year before, went to the president's office and asked or demanded that the name of the business school, that they take the name off the school. And this is happening in a lot of places in our country. Anyone who has been affiliated with any wrongdoings in the past is now being thought of in a different light. I was just reading the paper this weekend. So one city is actually taking Thomas Jefferson down, you know? And so this kind of, this conversation is happening in lots of places. Here, it was about one of our presidents, our early presidents at the turn of the century, Woodrow Wilson. This was a competition between 3 offices. We ended up winning. The prompt for the competition was the trustees came together and said, we can't remove the name off the school, but here's some money. Let's do a design to talk about Wilson's good parts and his bad parts. So it's a very kind of democratic way of thinking. Getting into Wilson, we found a very conflicted person. And we tried to figure out ways in which to have a conversation about Wilson. And I used W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American scholar, as a way of having a conversation. Du Bois came up with the terminology double consciousness. And he talked about this veil in which in America, race creates this kind of veiled, how can I say, scenario where Black people are constantly wearing a veil because they're being defined from the outside. And through that definition, that forces us then to be that definition. So when we're around certain groups, we're not ourselves. We have to have that other consciousness. When we're around ourselves, we can be ourselves. And so this idea of constantly going back and forth creates a consciousness, something that people of privilege don't have to deal with. They can just be them singular self. They don't have to have empathy for others. And so using this from the souls of Black folk, we were able then to have a really critical eye towards someone that I didn't know, but of someone of another race that I could have this conversation with. And so located at the center of the campus, we have the Fountain of Freedom. We have the Cornell Rothschild's Bosque of Trees located here. This is also the civic life of the town of Princeton, not only the university. Skateboarders love this place, right? And so you get a lot of use here, not only students, but you also get a lot of city use. The concept is very simple for this piece. We took a square, rotated it, and cut it in half along its long ends. The black part stayed vertical, and then the white part rests on it. It in a way becomes emblematic, right, of the construction of culture where the enslaved, the working, support those that are privileged. And once this was done, we then took the inside. When they're rotated, it has the greatest dimension of the square. The outer side, we put all of Wilson's writings, but on the inside, we wanted to have his detractors. It's almost like literally opening him up and giving him a consciousness is a kind of a metaphor for the project. And so it's about the same height as the building. Again, smack in the center. We took out a bosque of trees, and now the piece actually occupies that same space. So it doesn't change the sociology per se, but visually it changes how you experience it. And then his detractors or his contemporaries were really pushing him to be a better man. But as we know in history, he decided that he didn't have to listen to them. Everyone from Ida B. Wells to Du Bois, to Susan B. Anthony, who stood for days outside the White House protesting for women's rights, to no degree. And then really thinking about Wilson and his contribution to education, to national policy, to all of these things, we were able then to engrave a lot of these things on the outside and inside. This is a view from the Fountain of Freedom looking through. You can kind of see the heights of the piece. And then this is the piece standing. From one side, it's made of stone glass, so it's reflecting its surroundings on one hand. But as the light gets muted, the color comes out. And on one side of the interior, we then have images of people who were pushing him to be better. And they're lenticular, so as you walk past, they actually move. And then on the other side of the interior is stainless steel reflective, and those are their words. So they're basically bouncing off of each other in the middle, and on the outside, muted, are Wilson's words. This gives you a sense of the scale and the reflective nature. And again, it forces you to occupy a space in a very particular way. And Wilson's words, it's almost like a cartouche. You have to go out of your way to actually read them. And so our hope is as students come by, anyone visiting, they'll find some moment to actually read through some of these and really get to know him through his words. So last summer, not this past summer, but the summer of 2020, I was still meeting with some of the students who were still vehemently opposed, to getting the change name. This is opening day. I was so impressed with the president who was able to inaugurate the piece amongst this gauntlet of students who were still claiming that the name should come down. So last summer, I got a call from the school director, and the trustees had a meeting last summer during the civil unrest, and one of the trustees came out and read a passage from the piece on the outside, and that was enough to sway their vote. So his name is no longer on the school. It's just the School of Public Policy at Princeton. And whether, that's something that is evoked, through this piece, but I would argue that it's through the voices of the students that created a context for creating a piece that then created a space, right? And so now this is a space that has kind of meaning tied to it, not just through the object, but to the collective kind of cultural patterns and practices. And so when you're looking at one, you see the other. So there's this constant back and forth. It's present in the center of Princeton. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, for your profound presentation. It's really lovely to hear a little bit more in depth about some of your recent work. We now have about 30 minutes for a more open discussion, a Q&A session. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so please feel free to write them in the Zoom Q&A. It's located at the bottom of your screen along the bar there. As those start to come in, perhaps we can start with a couple of questions on our end. I can invite Jake to ask the first question.
Sure, thank you, Susie. Walter, your work does a lot to demonstrate how landscape connects to memory and oral histories, and to how it is not only privy to the formation of these narratives, but can further play a role in communicating them back to a larger audience. It's about uncovering and engaging the public, both familiar and with untold stories. Is there something distinct about the landscape that you feel affords the strong connection to narrative?
Yeah, I mean, landscapes are unlike buildings. Buildings disintegrate and get washed away. Landscapes continue, right? Landscapes have this palimpsest. It's almost like if you think of, making Bibles, right? The early making Bibles through wax, right? You make one, you layer it again, you layer it again. And architecture can have palimpsests, but in a lot of civilizations, you can kind of see, cities come and go, but those landscapes are still there. And I spent a year in Rome back in the mid-90s, and I went on a lot of archaeological digs, and it really changed my mind about how I view landscape, right? Landscape for me is not this decorative surface, right, to make a kind of just a two-dimensional form. It's something that, we talk a lot about digging, exhuming, these kinds of things in the studio. So there's always, in every project, we ask ourselves, there has to be something that's strange that comes out of it, right? Because, something happened everywhere, whether you like it or not, right? And, it's not like, we want to bring, all the tragedies to fold, but I was taken by something, Jimmy Baldwin, American writer, talked about that. Black folk in America, man, we carry around, pain, but we also carry around joy, right? And so this ability to kind of like have both in your life, I think it's something that we feel more people should be able to do that. And you find a lot of people only able to compartmentalize, right? Can only do one thing at a time. And I think landscapes have to be this multiplicitous, right? It has many layers to it, because if not, you're leaving someone out, right? You're leaving someone out. And I think it's more than just, acknowledging. I think we have to go out of our way sometimes, right, to get people to see something that's there, that's really there. Hope I answered your question.
That's great. Yeah, perfect.
I have a question that's sort of related to that. And thinking about the rise in environmental risk and climate imperatives today, it seems there's a kind of refound focus on the technical and performative aspects of landscapes. We're increasingly foregrounding, say, ecological processes and environmental resilience, particularly in things like landscape urbanism. Do you think that along the way we've lost sight of some of the more sociocultural roles of landscape and their role in society? And I say that acknowledging some of the great work you showed us today as kind of exceptions, maybe your U-Buffalo Solar Strand as kind of emerging examples of starting to synthesize and merge these things.
Yeah, I mean, I like to look at landscapes as hybrid, right? It's not, landscape architecture tends to go through these cycles of coming up with, I don't know, these themes for some reason. It's like one year it's like sea level rise, another year is landscape urbanism. It's all of these things that take your eye off of what's the challenging job. How do we live together? This is the thing, and all of these things, they're like, I don't know, they're like shiny lights, right? They just take our eye off. And on one hand, for me in the last couple of years, it's very clear that in some cases, people don't want to live together because we do everything to sort of keep ourselves separate. And so I think the job, particularly for our studio, is that, you know, the technology is part of what we do, right? There's just these baseline things that, you know, we're taught in school. I'm taught to move water, get water off of a site, right? You think of planting, flora, fauna, all these things are baseline things for landscape. They're not concepts, right? If we were doing our work, we should be dealing with tide flow. We should be dealing with all of these environmental issues. And so I find it that it's so easy to say, oh, we should be looking at ecology, but we've got to look at how we live in these places. And the technology, again, those are our tools. That's the things that we do. And in a way, we've given up a lot of those things. I mean, when I was in school in the 80s, I mean, we did our own engineering. We did grading, we moved water, we did all of that. We didn't give it to a civil engineer. It wasn't until I went on to professionals like, we don't get to do that? The civil engineers? But those are the things that, you know, we find joy in the studio in thinking about water and thinking about plants, but they're not the thing, right? That's what we do. And so once you give that stuff focus, I think then there could be power in the landscape. It could begin to evoke things and then get people to see these other things in the landscape other than a bioswale. Right?
Yeah, no, that's great. And also got me thinking a little bit about how you're blending theory with practice. So our next lecture in the series is on that topic of theory and practice, and we're going to be fortunate to have Dr. Felicia Davis joining us. But it struck me that your work is also sort of blending these two, that you draw from academia and theory as well as a professional practice. I wondered if you could say a bit about how your work is informed as your role as both a practitioner and an educator. How do you bring various pedagogical approaches into your professional work and vice versa, so that we can kind of get past those baselines of learning about water management, but get into some of the additional richness of landscape and what it has to offer design?
Well, it's like I tell my students, you know, and it took me a while, you know, to sort of get to this place, but I had great mentors along the way. But this idea that, you know, I don't think landscape firms should be service-based firms, right? What I mean by that is there are lots of service-based firms. Someone needs a parking lot, site design, a landscape architect design a site. So it's just service. Like, where does the dumpsters go? You know, we try to be idea-based work, right? That's a big difference between the two, right? And I've worked in service firms and I didn't know I was working in a service firm. I was like, why aren't nobody talking about ideas, right? It's like really just talking about, okay, we need a cool bench over there. We need this over there. But really stepping back. To have a career in design, I think you have to think about ideas, right? And as you get older, you change, and therefore you're then able to move through the culture of design. And the culture is awesome if you're interested in it. You know, it's like right now, I'm hard to get my students to be excited by history, you know, to even know landscape history, right? But this is kind of the cornerstone, right? I mean, this is what we do. And so everything today is new. As one of my students said to me yesterday, it's like, please help me. I'm tired of going to Pinterest. How do you do these things? I gave him an article to read. It's like, you think, right? I try not to look at images, right? I try not to look at landscape architecture magazines of other things. And we try to sort of, again, think of ideas. And so right now, some of the larger ideas we're thinking about in the studio is how is race being framed, right? Through the medium of landscape. And some of J.T. Mitchell's idea, you know, about, you know, through the post-colonial, which tends to want to make everything the same, it's really hard then to see difference. And so then if you understand that what we're making out in the world is the same thing over and over, right? But if you get that, you can actually start to see these creases where you can actually get difference, or you can actually push back a little bit. 25 years ago, I didn't have that understanding. I remember being on a jury asking someone, why are you giving this picturesque design an award? I mean, I didn't have that view of why. The reason why was it was the same thing, and the same thing gets valued. And so this way of sort of using information, and particularly that comes out of our discipline and the allied disciplines, architecture, art, sculpture, music, all of those things might give us a way of thinking about new futures versus hearkening back to the same stuff over and over and just calling it something different. It still looks the same.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Oh,
No, go ahead.
sorry, Jake.
No, go ahead.
I just saw a question pop up in the Q&A, which maybe I can, did you want to follow up on Walter's thought, or what do you think?
No, go ahead.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So we have a question about the role of landscape in dense urban cores. Colton's asking, when it comes to cities of monstrous scale, such as Tokyo or Hong Kong, with such a priority of developing a verticality to accommodate the needs of society, how does one look at those architecturalized city fabrics with an intention to integrate a sense of natural landscape when it has a high potential to get lost within the shadow of architecture?
I think that's a really good question, but I think you have to understand the cultural context as well, right? And so, a lot of the landscapes in the East, people have a different view of landscape. And that view, I don't think, at least from my experiences, it's very different from everything from the politic down to the social order to everything. And so it's hard to, on one hand, to critique a culture that chooses to live in these densified ways and still kind of looks out to landscape. And I think one has to have an understanding, about why do certain cultures choose to look to other places to import and what might those issues be. And I think a lot of it has to do with, the commodification of landscape, right? And that the landscape has become this kind of commodity, right? That you can actually, sell. I mean, I was just in Shanghai before the pandemic, and there were places, if I closed my eyes and looked around, I could be in America, right? And so again, I think if we look closer at a place, we might begin to kind of see how those places have an understanding of context, which might help us reconceptualize how we think of the landscape in other places. And I know I didn't answer his question.
I think in some ways we kind of set the stage for the next question, but also the previous question we talked about your ideas-based work, and your experience with exhibitions, lectures, and theoretical projects. How do you decide what is the most appropriate venue for the work that you do now?
What do you mean?
Just based on all the projects you've shared so far, there's a narrative behind it in terms of what you shared from some of the projects. You're trying to raise awareness about the racism, et cetera. So how do you in terms of how do you approach these projects now?
What I tried to show was a diversity of work, but also what I tried to show was that even though works were different, there's a kind of a similar way of thinking about landscape, right? Whether I'm making an object or whether I'm making a place, it is still imbued with these things that we're interested in, right? Like the ground. In the last decade or so, we have been having this interest in, how do we get out of, how can I say, paving plans, right? Landscape paving plans, right? Paving images, right? I mean, how do you get out of that? And for us, some of this, how can I say, exhuming has actually created a different way of actually thinking about materials and their representation, right? So no longer are we just looking at, doing stone and soldier courses and things like that. A lot of our projects now, we're using stone and materials that are unfinished, unrefined, because we're finding this primitive aspect of it says something a little louder. You see that in the stacked stone in Santa Monica. Now we're working on a project where we're actually creating a ground plane of rough, large boulder stone. So again, it's as if you're right in the middle of quarrying, right before you put it in the oven and cut it up. So again, really trying to to have other ways in which to, I was telling one of my assistants today, not to kill the material, right? It's like, you know, you go to like a new landscape project, it's like the materials are dead, right? Because they've been all refined. So how do you leave some life, right, in the materials? And so stone, wood, steel, I mean, all of these materials, right, can begin to reflect and give you just a different way of kind of thinking about mixing them, which, you know, continues a career, which gives me another decade.
Susie, did you have a question?
Sure, I can jump in.
Sure.
Since we have a large number of students and practitioners in the audience, I wondered if you could say a bit about your approach as a designer to field research, coming to know a place. I'm reminded of your work in urban diaries some decades ago, and kind of drawing from photo documentation, site inventories, daily journals, to, as you say, kind of fully bring the human condition into the design process. Could you say a little bit about the evolution in your methods of inquiry?
Yeah. We don't do a lot of mapping in my studio, right? We don't do a lot of what I call excessive mapping, you know, mapping just to map. We try to take the projects, and based on the projects that we're working on, that gives you the frame for the research, right? So if I'm working on a sculpture, you know, the research is based on making a thing. If I'm working on a landscape, whether it's like I'm working on a greenway in one place, I'm working on a square in another place, I'm working on a garden in another place, all of those suggest different ways into a project, right? And so we try to look at the project context as the research. So it's not like you're just going and collecting data, right? So everything is focused to a certain degree. And we found that that differentiates us from other practices where you get the mapping, and then you get the same design over and over again. What we're trying to do is through the research that's about the site and the place is to come up with something that's different. Not that it's unique, but something that's different that comes out of the place. An example, in Washington, D.C., we were asked to do a town square for a community whose history was slowly being erased because of suburbanization. And that history relates back to enslavement and freedom in DC in one of the first freedmen's villages, which were when the slaves were free in the North, they basically created these towns. The town has since been erased. It's Arlington Cemetery. You know, there's no trace of that diaspora. Trying to understand this, our meeting was a bus trip because people kept talking about a landscape that wasn't there. So I was like, show me. And so over a day, we had the community take us around and point us to all these places. Now that couldn't help us recreate the place, but it sparked an idea that we would have never had if we'd never had that conversation with folk, right? And so every project is different. And we, you know, again, go out of our way to try to create that context so that we know we're not bringing baggage to the next project, right?
No, that's great. We have another question in the Q&A from Ted. He says, the work is excellent, open, and powerful, and the ideas also. My question is one I often like to ask successful architects. How often do you turn a project or client down for ethical, political, or ecological reasons or grounds? Can you give a recent example or an example that was decisive for your practice?
That's a really good question. A lot of projects that don't fall into our wheelhouse are corporate projects. A lot of corporate projects where we see that it's not having an impact on what we call a larger kind of a cultural setting. For a while, I refused to do housing projects because the landscape architects are not doing the site planning in this country, which then forces you to only decorate the housing. So stop doing that. Other projects, some that are political and going into areas and changing areas without, having a strong recourse for groups of people who are there. We choose to not work on those kinds of projects. On the other side, though, we are interested in projects that have contestation, like the Woodrow Wilson one. We're now working on a project, if you know Berkeley, it's called People's Park. And People's Park was a site that was taken over by students during the civil unrest of the 60s, and it's been a contested site since then. In the last decade or so, it's just become a site where that memory is there, and it's not a healthy site. And now that housing is a big problem, the university needs to build housing, but we chose the project as an opportunity to get the university to not forget People's Park. So in a way, we're playing, it's almost like we were hired by the people at People's Park when we're actually hired by the university. So, some things we draw a hard line to, and some things there's a softer line that we try to figure out, can we actually, work through this? And then some projects we can't, and we just walk away. There have been a few projects that I've walked away from because people were not interested in the ideas, they were interested in me, right? Right, the face of Walter going. And once we realize that, I walk away, right? So it's a very complex answer, but it's one I think that, really forces you, very early, I think in practice, to check your values, right? And, I think the studio here, we really try to keep those values out front, right? So that when we get someone calling, we're hoping they're calling because of the way we work. And so when we start working, there's an understanding that this is how we work and these are the values.
Great. Picking up on the term contestation, I found that was interesting. Where is landscape architecture truly excelling?
I have no idea. I don't know about you guys. I move around the landscape of my city, and most of the time I'm just disgusted with all the decisions that we're making. And I was asking people in my studio at class, it's like, when was the last time there was an idea in landscape that actually did something in a universal way? And we were talking about like the great parks of the late 19th century, right? I was talking to one student because we were talking about Olmsted and all these ideas. But when you read a lot of the writing from the late 19th century, it's kind of this optimism, right, about culture. And from a pragmatic point of view, I think we've kind of lost some of that experimentation, right? Right. I mean, American, philosophy is pragmatism, and this notion that I just remember reading something by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was one of the first Supreme Court justices, but a true theorist for pragmatism. He said, pragmatism is the belief that if I put something out in the world will meet me halfway. And I thought that was pretty profound because it suggests a kind of, I wouldn't say experimentation, but a kind of this idea of taking risk, right, in the world about how we want to share this planet together. And that it's not about the metrics and looking for the answer, maybe. Maybe we haven't taken enough risk, that we're in this kind of safe siloed thing. And I do think, housing is a huge problem in the world, right? And can't think of any models that we're adopting that's helping us deal with our issues. When I walk through architecture studios, I don't see people thinking in those radical ways that we need to be thinking to solve some of these, what I found, profound issues that we're facing. So I don't know. I don't know.
Perhaps just one final one. I keep being a little bit conscious of time so that we don't hold you all night. This is a great discussion, though. You have a remarkable career with a portfolio that spans not only kind of different geographic contexts, but also several decades. What does it mean to revisit your projects years later to see how they've evolved or adapted to their context?
It means that Walter doesn't go to his projects. It depends. One of my first projects that we did in my studio here, probably like 25 years old now, I return to it every now and then, and it's a very simple project. It's in a very impoverished neighborhood, and we planted 150 purple leaf trees side by side for 5 blocks. And every now and then I just go there and return because the project cost $180,000. I was able to finagle ways to get it built. But the thing that it taught me was in places where there's little investment, if you just think differently, it's an investment and it can be there. And so it's those kinds of projects I like returning to because they just kind of keep reaffirming that you can keep going because, a generation now has experienced that landscape. And when we were working with the kids there, those kids came up seeing that bosque of trees, right? And that's probably going to stay with them their entire life. So those are the kinds of projects I like to return to. Landscapes require maintenance. I've gotten over, the kind of, is everything going to still be in its place if I go back 10 years? Landscapes are messy. I like when landscapes kind of find another rhythm that we didn't give them. But, it's not my expectation that our landscapes will always be there. We welcome over time people adding another layer to them because that's, again, part of the values that we see that should be instilled in landscapes.
That's great. There are a couple other Q&A things I can try and synthesize so that we don't go too much over. Or Jake, I don't know if you've had a chance to look through them, if you wanted to read out any of the Q&A. So Maria is asking if there are any books you would recommend to students and practitioners today.
Oh, there's so many. Depends on what you're interested in. Right. Over the last 18 months, I actually returned to a lot of kind of early novels. I returned to a lot of authors that, I hadn't spent time with, like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, people really writing in a way about change, identity, and context. I think J.T. Mitchell's recent book, Seeing Landscape Through Race, is a really wonderful book where he talks about, this kind of moment we're in, but he also makes relationships to Christo's piece in Central Park, and he relates that to the Jewish territory in Palestine as also relating that to the US. And so there's a lot there, but he makes it very clear. He gives us a way to talk about race. And I think that's something that in landscape, we never have had, we've never had the structure in which to do it. I don't know about Canadian education. I think it followed pretty much the American model. Social factors was a really big thing in the 80s and the 90s, where the metrics were much more about behaviorism versus really thinking about the cultural turn and bringing in other voices, whether they're voices that talked about gender, voices that talked like JT about race, about identity, and how do we begin to grapple with that in landscape? I think landscape is probably 20 years late on that. historian Diane Harris, landscape historian, she wrote a piece in 2003 that really advocated that. And that's a piece of the book that I'm writing right now in a class that I teach. And so I would push to really, you know, on one hand, we have these wonderful, how can I say, cultural geographers, right? That's written about landscape, J.B. Jackson, you know, I mean, there's just abundance, but they really don't give us a way to make, right? They document more. And I think a lot of these writers help you sort of tease through ways of making and ways of dealing with, you know, people who don't look like yourself, people of other gender persuasions, and give us ways to talk about it, to be articulate about it, and not to be afraid. And I think one of the bigger things that we don't talk about race is people just are afraid to do it because we don't have the tools to talk about it. So that was 2 books.
That's great. I see that we're nearing 7:30, and I'm trying to be conscious of Zoom fatigue, and everyone's been so generous with sharing their time this evening. So thank you so very much, Walter. This is an incredibly engaging talk we've had. I've really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks also to my colleague Jake for joining the discussion and weighing in on things. Thank you to the audience for attending this evening. Please join us for upcoming lectures. I'll share the poster so everyone can see what those are. So our next lecture doubles as the Charles Gordon Memorial Lecture, and we're going to have Dr. Felicia Davis speaking about reassembling practice with theory, and that's on Monday, the 22nd of November at 6 p.m. So for any more information about these future events or to watch some of the recordings of the previous ones, please see the school's website. So incredible thank you again to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on your Tuesday evening, Walter.
No problem, Susan and Jake. Glad it worked out, and it's a pleasure getting to know you guys, and hopefully we'll see each other in person someplace in the world.